And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Derana 24. Tonight on this exclusive episode with the Visiting Assistant Secretary, Bureau of South and Central Asia Affairs of the United States, Donald Lu, who's visiting in Sri Lanka.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Warm welcome to you. You're here in Sri Lanka on a two-day visit as part of your visit to the region.
Correct.
Let's talk a little about your visit this time.
I look forward to, can I just say what an honor it is to be on your show. I'm a big fan. Thank you so much for having me. I'm
indeed honored. Thank you very much.
So let me just say a word about why I'm here. So we started off in Chennai to meet with members of our team in India. And then I'm here in Sri Lanka to talk to members of government, to civil society, and thinking about the country as it goes into elections. And then I'll go on from here to Dhaka, to Bangladesh, to meet with government, civil society, talk about the important work we're doing there.
Assistant Secretary, I think we're talking about key priorities for the South and Central Asian region that the United States has, and you will be looking into these as you embark on a series of discussions with authorities here in Sri Lanka. Let's talk about what you've discussed so far and what you intend to talk to our authorities.
Well, so much of what we're talking about is on the economic side. We are so enthusiastic about progress that we can see in Sri Lanka on its economy and stabilizing its currency and the inflation here. We know that people are suffering, but we also can see rays of hope. And we are hoping that that economic progress continues to move forward. We want to be part of that with investment, with targeted assistance, and with supporting the vision to carry out reform in this beautiful country.
You speak about progress made in Sri Lanka. Do you think Sri Lanka is out of trouble?
That's a great question. Let me say what I know to be true, which is Sri Lankan people have suffered greatly in these last many months, but that we can see real progress having been made. Progress thanks to the leadership of government, of the Sri Lankan people, but also the support of the IMF and some of the partner countries as well. We could not be happier to see some of that progress, but we also would hope that the support by the IMF is able to continue, and that will be based on whether Sri Lanka can continue this really challenging road to reform. Finding out how to broaden the tax base, finding out how it's going to continue to reduce subsidies while protecting the poor and the marginalized, but to reduce subsidies across the board that frankly benefit the rich. These are tough tasks, and we are looking forward to being a good partner of Sri Lanka.
Also, as you talk about economic reforms, it was revealed recently, just days back, that the laws will be passed in Sri Lanka to ensure that the reforms agenda undertaken as part of the EFF of the IMF will be implemented in Sri Lanka. We're heading into elections, and the US has continuously requested Sri Lanka to ensure that debt treatment be fair and transparent. What have you got to say about the progress so far in debt restructuring, as well as in Sri Lanka looking to formalize agreements made with external creditors?
Well, we are really encouraged that Sri Lanka has made so much progress so far on debt restructuring. It's not done yet. There's important negotiations going on between the OCC chair people as well as the Sri Lankan government. And we have said, and the Paris Club has said, that debt restructuring needs to be comparable for all creditors. So far we see a tremendous commitment by the Sri Lankan authorities to do just that. Let's hope that the next chapter moves as smoothly as the last one.
I'm also interested to know how the Bureau engages with countries in the South Asian region, with India, Sri Lanka, and other nations in the region.
Well, I am blessed to work in a really interesting part of the world. So much is happening in South Asia. There is tremendous economic opportunity, and there's also risk that we're seeing in this part of the world. So much of it has to do with whether countries in this region are embracing competition. My view is where there is competition, countries really succeed. Where there's no competition, investors come and maybe they produce projects which are not really serving the needs of the people and dig countries deep into debt. Where there's competition, we can see all of the many investors and participants come in with an even playing field and work for the benefit of the people of the region.
How would you, in that context, look at Sri Lanka and look at Sri Lanka's situation, especially when we talk about competition, readiness to doing business with the rest of the world, and looking at an economy that sustains Sri Lanka's reforms?
Absolutely. Well, I think you know Sri Lanka has been through a pretty difficult economic crisis in the last couple of years, but that there is a sense of hope in that leaders, both in opposition and in government, have embraced the need for change. There needs to be a sustainable basis on which to operate government, which means broadening the tax base so they can pay for services for Sri Lankan people, but also having the subsidy regime be one that is sustainable over the long term. The IMF is really focused on making that happen. I can see that political leaders across Sri Lanka are increasingly embracing that agenda.
As we talk about the crisis here in Sri Lanka too, many say Sri Lanka is moving out of the crisis, but the shocks felt in this economy outside will linger on for some time. What will the US priorities be for the island, especially as a development partner?
Well, we are committed as a partner of Sri Lanka to continue to provide assistance, but also advice and support. The biggest thing that we can do as a foreign partner is to support
Single Finance.
Sri Lanka's journey with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the Asian Development Bank, to make sure that Sri Lankans have access to good economic advice, but also eventually good credit that will help them develop their country.
Currently, how is this support coming in? You say advice in terms of good advice for restructuring the economy or debt, but going forward, we're also talking about the state-owned enterprises restructuring efforts here as requested by the IMF.
Right.
Assistant Secretary, if you can elaborate to us how the United States will look into helping Sri Lanka, especially manage these difficult times going forward.
Well, we do a couple of things. The first thing that I'm really pleased to say is when there was deep crisis here and people were suffering so much, we came and we delivered specific targeted assistance in the area of food, but also of fertilizer, so that Sri Lankan farmers could produce food for themselves. Now that we're into a different phase, we are really quite focused on helping to grow the economy. We have recently announced a $553 million investment in the Port of Colombo West Container Terminal. This is a private sector-led investment that will make profit for the Sri Lankan people and really grow the economy. We are all about private sector-led investment.
As we talk about investment, the controversy surrounding regional superpowers as well as the United States, India and China remains a question here in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka's sovereignty, whether Sri Lanka can exert and manage for the interest of the island. How much of a priority is this for the United States?
Well, I think it's definitely true that there are many big powers all around the world who are competing for influence in the Indian Ocean and particularly in Sri Lanka. One of the things I like to say is the United States is such a great partner because we are far away. We have no territorial claims on countries in the Indian Ocean. We just very much want countries in this part of the world to continue to exercise sovereignty over their territory, but also their territorial waters, and that they continue to grow as democracies and that the people become prosperous.
However, here in Sri Lanka, while the people have been grateful for the support that came in during the crisis and previously, especially from development partners and bilateral partners such as the United States, there have been controversial statements made that the United States has continued to interfere in internal matters of the nation, be it overthrowing a government or pushing for certain projects that may impact Sri Lanka's security. My question is whether there are any agendas for the region or Sri Lanka.
Well, you say this idea that we overthrow governments. Let me say very clearly, we're not overthrowing any governments. What we are doing is that we continue to value democratic, free and fair elections and peaceful elections. And one of the things that we will do as Sri Lanka enters this period of both presidential and parliamentary elections is put our resources and our attention towards encouraging this country to hold free, fair, nonviolent elections. That is a commitment on our side.
But are there any concerns going forward, especially this is a period of crisis or trying to overcome crisis, but there is also an election due. In terms of democracy, freedom of expression, are there any concerns for the United States?
There are always concerns. What I can see as a foreigner coming to this country is you have a really strong civil society. We've met with civil society leaders this morning. You have an amazing press. Very courageous journalists who are out there telling the story every day. And we see you have an independent judiciary that makes decisions based on the law and not on the whims of government. If you can protect those three institutions, I think this democracy will be strong into the future.
Politically speaking, are there any observations that you'd like to share with us about Sri Lanka's political situation?
Well, I think just as the United States, Sri Lanka is heading into a presidential election. And there are questions about what will happen afterwards. I know that the Sri Lankan people deeply believe in democracy and are tired of the economic problems this country has faced. And so I believe any leader, whoever emerges as the next president, whether it's President Wickremesinghe or one of the opposition leaders, will listen to the people of Sri Lanka and continue down the path of reform. That's what I hope for all the people of Sri Lanka.
We're talking about also post-elections and post-crisis stability for Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Once the EFF External Fund Facility is properly implemented with the reforms undertaken, once the Committee of Creditors agree with formalization of their in-principle agreements, building trust becomes a priority for Sri Lanka with investors outside. What kind of a role can the United States play here for Sri Lanka to go out there to work with investors and other partners across the world to build and rebuild that trust and image of Sri Lanka?
Well, you're talking about a really important moment that is coming, I hope, soon, where the international creditors, through the leadership of the Paris Club and India and Japan and France, will hopefully come to terms with the contours of the restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt. Once that's decided, once all of the external creditors have a deal in place, it will reopen the possibility of Sri Lanka to get loans again from the international community. The big international banks, the commercial creditors, will once again be able to invest in this economy. That's when you're going to see a really important shift in the well-being of Sri Lankan people. I'm excited about that. I know this government, the Sri Lankan people have worked hard to get to this point. There's more work to be done, but you have the full support of the US government.
With crises as these, especially there have been many analysts and countries such as yours that have warned Sri Lanka that falling into trouble is inevitable with partners who might have different agendas. But how do you analyze Sri Lanka's situation in working with the countries that come into our aid, but also in accommodating certain interests that are important for their security interest? And what must Sri Lanka look out for?
Well, maybe I could just say, honestly, we want Sri Lanka to have good relations with all of its neighbors and partners, and that includes China. We want China to be a good partner for Sri Lanka, to offer loans and projects that are reasonable according to international standard, that are not corrupt, and that address the needs of the Sri Lankan people. What I can see around the world is where countries compete, where if Sri Lanka allows the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, India to compete on an even footing here, China and other partners will be reasonable partners as well. We have seen that across the world. But where we don't compete, where only China is allowed to invest and to act, we do see problems, because without competition, there have been issues related to corruption, there have been issues related to the quality of infrastructure being produced. We want an even playing field where all of us compete for the kind of development that Sri Lankan people deserve.
There's also sentiment raised by certain quarters that countries such as Sri Lanka do not have the authority or the power to make our own decisions, internal decisions, as power play is seen in countries as Sri Lanka. How do you look at this?
Well, I think the history of the last couple of years proves that to be false. Sri Lanka is taking, and looks to be continuing to take, sovereign decisions about its own territory, about projects in Sri Lanka, about its territorial waters. That is so important, that Sri Lankans do not yield their sovereignty to any power, certainly not to the United States or to any of the countries that are vying for influence here. If there's one thing I could hope for the Sri Lankan people, is that they will continue to jealously guard their ability to carry out policies and activities in their country with their sovereignty as their first priority.
Sri Lanka will resume stalled projects, especially Japan-funded projects as well, and China is looking at infrastructure development here in Sri Lanka. Key ports are partnered or funded by countries such as India and China as well. Going forward, any key projects that the United States will be involved in, other than the projects you're already engaged in here in Sri Lanka?
Well, we have been talking to the government about what more we can do in terms of investment. Our Development Finance Corporation already has nearly $1 billion invested in this economy, and we are looking for more opportunities. They have a cap in this region of about $4 billion, so there's plenty of room to continue to look for opportunities. But I again say, American investment is different than investment from other partners, in the sense that we demand, when we invest, that private sector companies are already putting money into those projects. These are not government white elephant projects that lead nowhere. These are places where the private sector already has confidence that we can make a profit for investors, but also for Sri Lankan people. That we will insist upon.
Sri Lanka's strategic location and sovereignty. I go back to security interests here. I'd like to ask a few questions at once. What is the security situation in the region as you analyze? There have been certain concerns about security threats, especially with India and China, with vessels passing by Sri Lanka and possibly using Sri Lanka as a field for these activities. But how does the United States look at the security interests of Sri Lanka and also maritime and regional security?
I hope that Sri Lankan people want Sri Lankans to defend their sovereignty and their territorial integrity, and not depend on the United States or any other country in the world. To do that, Sri Lanka will need greater capacities. We are working very closely with the Sri Lankan military to see what can we provide that enables them to do their jobs more fully and completely. We have provided 3 Coast Guard patrol vessels. We'll provide a 4th one next year. We're providing an aircraft this year that will help Sri Lanka surveil its territorial waters and its land to see what ships and what smugglers and what drug traffickers are doing in Sri Lanka's waters. And lastly, we're working with India, Australia, and Japan to provide commercial satellite data to the Indian military so that you can look down at your territorial waters and see in real time what vessels are in your space. Many other countries are already benefiting from this sort of data, and we're excited to be soon offering it to Sri Lanka as well.
වෛද්‍යවරු නිර්දේශ කර ඇති හඳුන්වා දෙන නව සිග්නල් ස්ට්‍රෝං ටීත්. ශක්තිමත් එනමලයක් දත්කොහරවලින් උපරිම ආරක්ෂාවක්.
බයෝක්ලීන් පිරිසිදු කිරීමෙන් පසුව පහසුවෙන් වියෝජනය වී යයි. හිතකර ශුද්‍ර ජීවින්ද ආරක්ෂාවී ස්වභාවික දිරාපත්වීමේ ක්‍රියාවලය අඛණ්ඩව සිදුවේ. උතුරා යෑම වලක්වයි. හෙට දන්න අය අදගන්නවා බයෝක්ලීන්.
ඔයාගේ ෆේවරිට් සන්සිල්ක් ෂැම්පු දැන් තවත් වැඩි දියුණු වෙලා. ප්‍රෝටීන් නැචරල් ඔයිල් සහ විටමින් මුසු ඇක්ටිව් මික්ස් එකකින් දැන් ඔබට ගැට අවුල් නැති ෂයිනි ලස්සන කෙස් කලබක් ලබා දෙයි. දිදුලන ස්මූත් ඝන කෙස් කලබකට. අදම මාරු වෙන්න සන්සිල්ක් ඇක්ටිව් මික්ස් එකට.
ඉවත්වන කුණු යලි රෙදි පිළිමත තැන්පත්වීම වළක්වන ඇන්ටි රීඩෙපොසිෂන් පොලිමර් තාක්ෂණයෙන් බබල් ලොෂන් පවුඩර්.
සුවඳ පැතිරේ හදින් හද අතරේ එදා මෙදා තුර විශ්වාසේ දේශීය ස්වදේශී කොහොඹ නම බැබලේ
ස්වදේශී කොහොඹ ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ අංක 1 ශාකසාර සබන්නාමය. විද්‍යාත්මක පර්යේෂණමකින් තහවුරු කළ දෑතර සුමුදු කෝමාරිකා සාරය සහිත ටීපෝල්.
මිල්ක් ප්‍රෝටීන් සපරි ලයිෆ් බොයි මයිල් කියා. තෙතමනේ රැඳි සුමුදු සමක් ලබාදී විස බීජවලින් සම ආරක්ෂා කරයි. සමට හිතකර බවට සායනිකව තහවුරුයි. දැන් රුපියල් 110ක අඩුමිලකට.
සේදු සුදු ඇඳුම් වලට සුදු දීප්තිය සහ පාට ඇඳුම් වලට වර්ණවත් දීප්තිය දෙන ප්‍රෝවයිට් තාක්ෂණයෙන් බබල් ලොෂන් පවුඩර්.
ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ අංක 1 ශාකසාර සබන්නාමය.
මගේ සම රෝස සුවඳකින් සරසන්න. මන බඳින හැඟුමන් දල්වන්න. මගේම රාණි සඳන් සමගින් රෝස් සහ සැෆ්‍රන්.
The US has imposed sanctions on countries such as Iran and Russia, but Sri Lanka works with these countries. How do you see the impact on smaller island states as Sri Lanka, and how can countries like Sri Lanka navigate these challenges while ensuring the good relations with these countries?
So I work in a region that includes Central Asia, and Central Asia has long historical ties to Russia, and because of that has commercial ties, some of which have resulted in secondary sanctions, which means Russian companies or entities are sanctioned, but some of these countries in the region I work on work with those companies and therefore themselves have incurred sanctions. We would hate for that to happen in Sri Lanka. You have enough problems not to have to worry about sanctions. So we are talking to government about how do we work together to avoid these sanction risks. And what I can see is your government is very smart in trying to make sure it maintains a middle path where it's keeping good relations, but also not creating problems for your businesses and your entities here.
Certainly. We'd like to also talk about the region and the impact of the ongoing wars in the region.
Sure.
Of course, the catastrophe, the disaster, the war in Gaza. The United States recently has been taking a step back in terms of media reports say that the loads of ammunition that were sent to Israel were halted by President Joe Biden's government. But with all this, how can we look at a sense of security for countries in the region and the rest of the world to ensure peace and security? You have been in most of these countries. You've been a representative, you've been a diplomat and a public service experience of some 3 decades in the United States. With all that experience, what do you have to share with us?
I hope that your viewers can see the effort being taken by President Biden, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, to try to bring this conflict to an end. The Secretary of State has visited 8 times to the Middle East to talk to partners to try to press for peace. President Biden is using the leverage of our arms supply to Israel to call for an immediate ceasefire. We have used our influence both with Israel and other partners to bring in humanitarian assistance. None of this is enough. This crisis continues forward, but I have faith that the efforts of many countries, including the United States, are very close to the point in which this conflict will be ended with a ceasefire. I live with that hope every day. I know that the people of Sri Lanka are hoping for that outcome as well. You have our full support as we all try to bring an end to this terrible crisis.
And Russia and Ukraine is also a key question, and many suffer as a result. Sri Lanka suffered too in terms of the services, the tourism, and everyone does, and the people there mostly. How will we see the United States taking a lead in solving global crisis?
Well, it's not just the United States. You can recall at the United Nations when this terrible conflict broke out more than 2 years ago, 143 countries, including Sri Lanka, voted to recognize Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's not just the United States. It's not just the West. All of us have to have interest in ensuring this conflict ends as soon as possible, and it ends according to the UN principles of independence of Ukraine, of its territorial integrity, and of its sovereignty. That's not only important for Ukraine, it's important for all of us that we respect this in the international community.
Moving back to Sri Lanka and the region, as I mentioned, you have worked in the region, especially South Asia and in Albania and other countries where you have been an ambassador, a deputy ambassador, and had several years of experience working with the region. What are the challenges you see that this region faces currently? And going forward, how can we see the unification of the region? South Asia, the least integrated region in the world, but how can we look at leveraging the benefits, the advantages that each of our nations have to help each other going forward?
Well, I can see a couple of things. I've worked in South Asia for almost 32 years now. And as a foreigner, I'm a little like a time traveler in the sense that I came to Sri Lanka maybe a little over a year ago. I've come every year for the past 3 years. I can see change. I can see progress. I think it's a little hard for people of South Asia to see that progress year after year because you see it in very small increments. But today I see actually South Asia more at peace than maybe ever in my lifetime. Right, the traditional conflict between India and Pakistan isn't really much of a factor right now. The real challenges for the countries of the region are almost entirely economic. You have real crisis that was here in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka, I hope, is emerging from that crisis. You have economic crisis today in Pakistan. You have concerns about the stability of the economies in Maldives and in Bangladesh. We can see that all of the region suffers from some of the same after effects of the COVID pandemic, but also the shock of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. All of this has an impact for people in this region, and I agree with you. The way that South Asia overcomes these difficult economic times is finding ways to work together. You're the most highly populated place on the planet. 26% of the world's population sits here in South Asia. This should be the part of the world that drives the economy of the planet, and the way you're going to do that is by finding ways to work together.
As we speak about South Asia and the economic challenges, I'd also like to move to talk about a health crisis we've faced. The pandemic brought us to a standstill, and countries like Sri Lanka, not just Sri Lanka, but the entire world, but especially I speak about Sri Lanka, the services industry and an economic crisis that was not expected so fast. Emerged, but at the same time we're talking to you here, where you've had so much of experience combating the Ebola crisis, a global pandemic that, of course, was not affected in this part of the region.
Yeah.
But let's take some experiences there and your outlook for health crisis and how the world should come together in combating these challenges.
So I am not an expert on public health, but my wife is. My wife has worked in public health for almost 30 years, has been working for the World Health Organization. And what she will tell me is that disease knows no borders, and that one thing that the COVID crisis taught all of us is unless we can work together, there is no way to stop pandemic disease. A single country cannot close its borders and expect to ride out a crisis like this. The only way we prosper, that we are able to overcome these obstacles, is by finding ways to cooperate. I would say one of the things to look at for all countries, but including Sri Lanka, is how did countries support one another during this crisis? Many countries tried to sell you very expensive vaccine that didn't actually work very well. Many other countries, including the countries of the Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, we were trying to give away free vaccine to this region and across Asia. We could see that unless we were able to help countries in the Indo-Pacific deal with this crisis, it would affect all of us. You cannot protect your home country until you are able to support fellow countries within your region.
You've worked in West Africa as the coordinator for Ebola response, as the former deputy coordinator of the US State Department, and in Pakistan, India, and many other countries. These 3 decades of experience working in public service and foreign service, what has it been and what would you like to share with us?
Well, it's interesting. I feel like after 32 years, I'm getting closer to the end than the beginning. My daughter is in her first year at university, and she has decided just this year she's considering working on international affairs. And it fills me with a little hope that a young woman in my family can see the benefit of taking on a really tough issue. There are many Americans who are disillusioned today because of the war in Gaza or the failure to overcome this conflict in Ukraine about working internationally. I think it should be the opposite. We need the smartest young Sri Lankans and Americans and people all over the world to work in diplomacy, to work for peace, to find ways of bridging cultural divide. That's the way we're going to get ourselves to a better world.
We've heard your envoy here in Sri Lanka also reiterating commitment to support Sri Lanka's development. And we carried recently a statement by US President Joe Biden's nominee for ambassador to Sri Lanka in the future, Elizabeth Host, who says that truth, reconciliation and transparency and justice will be supported in Sri Lanka, but also has expressed support for power devolution going forward. We're talking about devolution of power and the 13th Amendment and political stability here in Sri Lanka. In order to reach political stability, Sri Lanka also looks to support from external parties. And what is the how does the United States look at this?
Well, maybe before I talk about devolution of power, let me say how pleased I am that we have in Sri Lanka today one of our finest ambassadors anywhere on the planet, Ambassador Julie Chang. It is a statement of how we value our relationship with Sri Lanka that we have sent here such a capable diplomat. I am delighted to have the opportunity to work with Ambassador Chang. It is true, President Biden has nominated Elizabeth Horst, who is my deputy in Washington, to serve as the next ambassador to Sri Lanka. She is magnificent, brilliant, and someone who will be a very capable representative of our country in this beautiful island. It may take a little time in our system. You may know it can take months or even years of waiting to get ambassadors confirmed. So I'm thrilled that Ambassador Chung is here on the ground. Let me just say one word about devolution of power. It is so important that this legacy of the Civil War have some positive effects on the future of this country. We can all worry about the very negative things that happened in the Civil War, of the terrible loss of life, of the hardship on Sri Lankan people. But I am honestly a little comforted by some of the things that have been announced recently. The commitment by the President to hand over 27,000 acres of land to hill country Tamil families. That's an important step forward. I do think a functional truth and reconciliation process is something we're all hopeful for. I think finding ways to have dialogue and make sure that people who suffered in the war are able to tell their stories and that eventually there is justice for families in Sri Lanka. We stand for that. I hope that Sri Lankan leaders are looking for ways to make that possible.
And with elections around the corner, I'm sure...
Yours or ours?
Both countries, let's say. But here in Sri Lanka, I'm sure you have a very special message for our leaders and authorities here as you engage in discussions during your 2 days in Sri Lanka.
I'll be honest, one of the messages that I will carry is whoever emerges from this election and whoever gets the majority of seats in Parliament, we hope that the wisdom of following advice of very smart economists in the IMF, in the World Bank, in the Asian Development Bank, that process will continue. We want their children and the grandchildren of people here in Sri Lanka today to benefit from all of the wonderful resources of this country. What I worry about is political instability can bring about economic instability. Sri Lankans have had enough of that. Let's hope that whatever leaders in the future win these elections, that they are able to lead this country in a positive direction.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Liu, for your time here at Hyde Park. Of course, we wish you all the very best in your endeavors, especially in the region, in our countries, and in other parts of the world. But I also hope you get to experience Sri Lankan hospitality.
I have already had some incredible meals here and had a chance to visit Galle and take a tour of Colombo. I am honored to be in this beautiful country.
Certainly, you mentioned Ambassador Julie Chung, who I have had the pleasure of interviewing, and of course, Ambassador Chung has also been an ambassador for us here in Sri Lanka, talking about our food, our culture, and beautiful sceneries of Sri Lanka. Once again, I hope you get to travel a bit, but thank you for your visit here to Sri Lanka and of course to our studios as part of your visit here.
It has been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have been in conversation with the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, Donald Liu, joining us here at Hyde Park to talk about U.S.-Sri Lanka relations and how the United States will support Sri Lanka going forward, and specifically about the Assistant Secretary's visit to Sri Lanka as part of an Asian tour. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion. Until then, take care. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.
This is on the Derana 24, celebrating a decade of excellence.
ආයුබෝවන් දෙවැනි සිවුදකින් වාර්තා වූ පුවත් රටට කියන අද දෙරණ සිවුදෙස ප්‍රාදේශීය පුවත් විශේෂාංගය දැන් ප්‍රදේශ රසක මේ වන විට යලකන්නේ වීවාගා කටයුතු ආරම්භ කර තිබුණද ගොයම් ආශ්‍රිතව පැතිර යන ඇතැම් රෝගී තත්ත්වයන් සහ මූලික පොහොර සහනාධාරය නොලැබීම ගොවින්ට එල්ල කර ඇත්තේ දැඩි බලපෑමක්. මේ අම්පාර දිස්ත්‍රික්කෙන් වාර්තා වූ එවන් පුවතක්.
යලකන්නේ සඳහා ජලය නිකුත් කිරීමත් සමඟ ප්‍රදේශ රැසක ගොවීන් වී වගාව ආරම්භ කර තිබුණා. නමුත් කළුගල්ලොයේ ආය දෙක කොටසෙහි වගා කටයුතු සිදු කරන ගොවීන් පවසන්නේ වගාබිම් වෙත ප්‍රමාණවත් තරම් ජලය නොලැබෙන බවයි. එමෙන්ම වගාබිම් ආශ්‍රිතව ගොයම්ගස් කහපැහැ ගැන්වීමේ රෝගයක්ද පැතිර යන බවට ගොවීන් පවසනවා.
කොහොමද හදන්නේ බලන්න කොහොමද කරන්නේ කියලා. වතුර දෙන්නෙත් නෑ. වතුර දෙන්නෙත් නෑ. පොළොව කර වෙලා ගිහිල්ලා. පොහොර ගහ ගන්න විදියක් නෑ. පොහොර සහනාධාරෙත් නෑ. ගොයම් කහ වෙලා වල් බෙහෙත් දෙපාරක් ගන්න තියෙන මාතේ. මේවා බලන්න ඕනට වල්. 3600 මාතේ බෙහෙත් එක. අපි කොහොමද ජීවත් වෙලා මේ විදිය කුලියක් කෙල්ලක් නෑ. කුලිය කෙල්ල ජීවත් වෙන්නේ කොහොමද මාතේ මේ. පැයිල වැඩි. සරයි. මේ මිනිස්සු දවස් දෙකයි වතුර දෙන්නේ. දවස් දෙකයි පස්සේ මේ තනකල මේ ඇවිල්ලා මේ අලුත් කුඹුරු. වතුර මේ තනකල වැල්ල. තාම මේවා මඩ කුඹුරු නෙවෙයි. අද හැරුවොත් හෙට උදේ මේ පොල්ලක පස්සේ අනිත් පවද වතුර පින්ඩක්වත් නැහැ පේන්නේ. අයියා අපිට මෙහෙම කරන්නේ පොල් ටිකක් නැහැ. පොල් දැන් මාස 3ක් වෙනවා පොල් මේ පොල් සල් දානවා කියලා. ඒවා ලැබුණෙත් නැහැ අපිට. පියල් 6000 7000 බෙහෙත් ගන්න. ඒ තුන් පාර හතර පාර ගහලා කියනවා දැන් මේ කුඹුරු වල. ඉතින් තනි කොලේ මරන්න. වතුර දෙන්න හතරෙන් පහකට සැරයක් වතුර දෙන්න දුන්නත් මොකද වතුර දෙන්නේ. වතුරත් මරි මාත්.
ගොවීන් පවසන්නේ රෝග පාලනය සඳහා කොතෙකුත් කෘෂි රසායන යෙදුවද ඉන් පළක් වී නොමැති බවයි. වගබිම් ආශ්‍රිතව ව්‍යාප්ත වී ඇති වල් පැලෑටි මර්ධනය සඳහා කෘෂි රසායන මිල ඉහළ යාමත් මූලික පොහොර සහනාධාරයේ නොමැතිවීමත් ගොවීන් තම දුෂ්කරතාවට පත් කර තිබෙනවා.
ආධාර මාතේ තව වෙනකන් හම්බෙලා නැහැ අපිට. දැන් මාස එකමාරක් වෙනවා ගොයන් වල තනිකර ගහක් බෙහෙත් වලට නැහැ. පොහොරක් නැහැ. ඉතින් මේවා දැන් තාම මේ දීලා නැහැ නේ අපිට. කීවෙන් නම් කියනවා අපිට මේ පොහොර සහනාධාර දෙනවා කියලා තව වෙනකන් දීලා නැහැ අපිට. පොහොර සහනාධාර දැන් මේ ඒවා පොම් මම හිතේ බාර් දීලා දන්නෙත් නැහැ ලද්ද දන්නෙත් නැහැ. ගොයන් කපුවට පස්සේ දීලා වැඩ නැහැ නේ පොර සහනාධාර දෙනවා. තත් දෙවිනවාතේ හරි ගහ ගන්න අපිට පොර සහනාධාර දෙන්නේ නැහැ නේ මාත් බලන්න. කැලේ තමයි එන්නේ. බේත් ජවුවට කැලේ මරන්නෙත් නෑ. කොහොමද තමයි වෙන්නේ? ඒ අපිට බෙහෙත් සහනාධාරයක් නැහැ. කිසිම ආධාරයක් නැහැ.
අනාරක්ෂිත පාලමක් මතින් අවදානම් ගමනක නිරත වීමට සිදු වී ඇති පිරිසක් පිළිබඳවයි